Are we all set, Alex? Okay, I'm going to start the meeting. This is the Community Preservation Committee meeting. It's a training meeting Monday, February 22nd, 2021 at 6 p.m. This meeting can be viewed on frgtv.fredtv.us under video on demand, channel 18. Actually, I forgot the open meeting law notice. Hold on.
Jimmy, you're on mute.
Pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or video recording of this public meeting or may transmit the meeting through any medium. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made whether perceived or unperceived by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permissible. I'd like to take a roll call of the committee members, but first I'd like to introduce two new members, Caroline Aubin and Alex Sylvia. Welcome. They're both city council appointees. With that being said, could I get a roll call of the committee members? John Brandt.
Here. Here.
John Ferreira.
Here.
Caroline Aubin.
Here.
Alex Silva.
Here.
Kristen Cantero Oliveira.
Here.
And James Souza here. Victor Farias.
Here.
And we're missing Paul Machado. He was unable to attend this meeting today. He is our clerk and usually does the meeting minutes. Would some other member of the board volunteer to do the meeting minutes today? Anyone? Sandy, would you do them, Sandy?
Yes, I'll do them for you.
Thank you. Was there any citizen input, Sandy?
No.
And I'd also like to introduce Sandy Dennis. Could you just acknowledge yourself, Sandy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sandy Dennis, and I am the admin for the Community Preservation Committee.
No, you're not listening.
Welcome, Caroline, and welcome, Alex.
All I'm saying is it's not.
So there was no citizen input.
You see what I'm saying?
So with that being said, on to item number 5.
Yeah. And you were 25 years old.
So we have a little bit of background noise. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
You're guilty of felony. So if you
But does anybody else hear that at the moment? That's better. Item number 5, we have Stuart Saginaw from the Community Preservation Coalition here. He is going to do a presentation for us because, again, this was a training meeting for us. It's to get us familiar with different topics that have come up for discussion recently, and we sent him an agenda of those things. So he came up with a PowerPoint presentation, which he is going to show us and give us a little bit of insight onto CPC. And we can, in between that, if anybody on the board has questions, we can ask him questions in between this. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce Stuart Saginaw from Community Preservation Coalition. Are you there, Stuart?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Jim. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a PowerPoint presentation with some updates on CPA, and I think it'll be particularly helpful for Alex and Caroline as new members. Tell you a little bit about our organization, a little bit about CPA and what's happening statewide with CPA. And then Sandy had put some of these topics for discussion in the agenda. Some of them I had specific information to share with you, so I created slides for that. Other things on the list, I think it's more of a discussion that we can have, after when people asking questions and that sort of thing. And as Jim said, I'm happy to do this interactively. I think it works much better that way. So, as if we were all in the same room together, live, just chime right in if you have a question as we go along. I think that the idea of tonight's session was to give you guys all the information that you need to help your committee move forward. So that being said, let's see if we can find the Zoom meeting. And of course, that is the one thing that I don't see. All right. Hang on one second. Let's start the PowerPoint this way, see if that makes a difference. No. All right, Alex, I'm going to need your help here. Here we go. All right, I found it. All right, can everyone see that now?
Yes.
All right, sorry about that. It was hidden in the corner. All right, so let me just quickly tell you about the organization that I work for, the Community Preservation Coalition. We are a nonprofit based in Boston, and we're really just a combobulation of a lot of other nonprofits. Typically, you can see these are the main statewide organizations that operate in the open space industry in Massachusetts, affordable housing, and parks and recreation and historic preservation. So we have representatives from each of these organizations on our steering committee. They actually founded the coalition, these 6 organizations you see on the screen. We're based in the one in the bottom left corner at about 8 p.m. on your clock at the Trust for Public Land. We've been there for quite a while. Before that, we were at Preservation Massachusetts. And so they've passed us around a little bit over the years, but we've been at TPL for quite a while. In addition to the representatives from these organizations, we also have folks on our steering committee from CPA communities. So there are 8 folks who either are on a CPC currently or administrator for a CPC or formerly were on a CPC. And then we have some at-large members as well. And the steering committee meets quarterly. Our meeting is coming up, and the quarterly meeting is coming up at the beginning of March, and kind of work on all the legislative issues, policy issues for CPA, statewide organizations and conferences that we share with, presentations to legislative committees and state boards and committees and those sort of things. Our organization actually does the things that I think you'd find typical of, for lack of a better word, a trade association for CPA communities is what we do, but every municipal board sort of has an organization like ours. If you're on the CONSCOM, you have MACC, Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions. If you're on the planning board, they have a statewide association. There's even a statewide association for town clerks and city solicitors and all that sort of thing. But we work specifically with community preservation committees in the 186 CPA towns. We do lots of technical assistance questions. So if you ever have something that comes up that you have a question about, don't be bashful. It doesn't have to be Jim or just Sandy. Anyone who's on the CPC, or really anyone out in the community who has a CPA question, we're happy to help by email or phone. I'm going to show you our website in a second because I think that can be really useful to you, particularly for new members ramping up. Hopefully you're all getting our newsletter and our bulletins about CPA. If not, let Sandy know. We can get you on the list. We spend a lot of time on Beacon Hill. That's probably I think the most valuable service that we provide to our communities, because none of you are going to go up and talk to legislators and try to get a bill passed to make CPA better individually, but collectively, it's very effective working through a trade association like ours. We just helped some new communities adopt CPA, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, the typical things that you see in terms of trainings and webinars like this one, workshops, those are the sort of things we do to educate folks on CPA. A lot of folks ask how we fund ourselves. We do it through the traditional methods of a nonprofit by applying to foundations. We also get financial and in-kind support from the organizations that you saw on that last chart. But the biggest source of our membership is dues that community preservation committees pay to the coalition for our help in administering CPA statewide. And we're very lucky that almost every CPA community in the whole state has found us valuable enough to give us some of your hard-earned funds out of your administrative account. We really do appreciate that. All right, so particularly for Alex and Caroline, this website is really the only thing you are going to find on the internet about CPA. You will not find anything on the state of Massachusetts website about CPA. They consider it to be a local program. There's no CPA office at the state. There's no CPA staff at the state. For better or for worse, and I hope it's for better, we're it. And this website is really the only comprehensive website about CPA that you're going to find. CPA is unique to Massachusetts, so you won't even find it from other states as well. It was created here. It's sort of a homegrown piece of legislation. And when you look at the website, particularly, like I said, for new members or existing members who are trying to find information, this tab called Technical Assistance across the top, that's what I'd really encourage you to spend some time, particularly when new members come on the committee, to read through those technical assistance articles, or at least the ones that interest you. There are literally hundreds on there. I don't think we've ever taken anything off our website. We just keep adding to it over 20 years. So it might look pretty simple and organized on the top, but when you start digging down there is a ton of information that can really help you on CPA. So just to give you some quick overview before we dig into some of the issues that that you folks wanted to hear about, wanted to talk a little bit about the CPA statewide. As I mentioned, we do have 186 communities that have CPA across the state, and we added 10 more last year, 9 in the fall and 1 in the spring, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the interesting thing about it is, although we have about half the communities in the state, 186 is just about half, a little over half, we actually have 65% of the population living in a CPA community. And that's because over the past, I'd say, decade or so, the thing that's been most exciting is the number of new communities that have passed that have been cities. So we now have a lot of the large cities like Fall River in Massachusetts, whereas in the beginning, CPA was really a very suburban and small community act. So it's really been encouraging that the cities have finally discovered the program. And that's why the number of people covered by CPA has really skyrocketed. And I don't know if I'll be able to say this forever, but it's nice to say as of now, in 20 years, that no community has ever left the program. Everyone has been really happy with being a part of CPA and seeing the benefits of what it can do for their community. And we have never had a community exit the program. You can do it. You know, communities can vote CPA out the same way they voted it in. But we really have had tremendous excitement among all the communities that have CPA, and no one has done that. So I talked about the fact that we had some new communities last year. This is my favorite map of Massachusetts, the one that shows all the CPA communities. The towns are in green and the cities are in orange. And there was one small community on the ballot last spring, West Stockbridge in Western Massachusetts, all the way over on the New York border here. And then we had 9 communities on the ballot in November, and all 9 passed, which is unusual. I mean, normally, you know, we don't have a 100% success ratio when CPA goes to the ballot. But I think what we saw really interesting dynamic this past year is people have really rediscovered their open space and their parks in Massachusetts. You know, with the pandemic, the only place you can go to be safe is, you know, outdoors. And so people have really flocked to their parks and playgrounds and community gardens and trails and conservation lands. And that's what's the basic premise of CPA. Started as an open space and recreation program. It expanded a little bit with over the years with housing and historic preservation constituencies coming to the board before it was passed in 2000. But it started out as an open space and recreation program. So it's really, I think, a lot of communities have really rediscovered that and realized that it's very important to invest in their open space and recreation assets. Any way you look at CPA, whether you look at that map and you see how many communities across the state have adopted it, over half of them, or you look at this slide, which shows what's been done with the money. Any way you look at it, either way, it's been a huge success. Historic preservation is the most popular category of CPA. There have been about 12,000, a little over 12,000 projects that have been approved statewide in the first 20 years of CPA, and about half of them have been historic. That doesn't mean half the money has been historic, because the historic projects tend to be a little smaller. The money actually rolls up pretty evenly among these four categories statewide. But in terms of number of projects, historic is definitely the most popular category. In the open space category, which means conservation land, we've had almost 32,000 acres preserved of CPA open space. Recreation is definitely the hottest category of CPA right now. Some changes were made in 2012 that allowed communities much greater flexibility in rehabilitating your existing parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields. And that really has skyrocketed the number of projects for outdoor recreation. And CPA is for outdoor recreation only, not nothing indoor. And then lastly, CPA has really been a game changer for the affordable housing industry in Massachusetts. Over 20,000 units have either been created or supported in some way with CPA funds. So when you add it all up, between the local money that's raised in each community and those state matching funds that I'm going to talk about in a minute, it adds up to over $2.5 billion in just about 20 years. So it's really incredible how much the program has generated for those four CPA purposes. So the real excitement of the program is the matching money you get from the state. And, you can always raise your own taxes locally for anything through an override. And so CPA obviously has a component where a small surcharge is added onto your property taxes to go into your CPA fund. But you can always do that. The magic is that you get a matching fund from the state every year, like clockwork, if you adopt CPA. It's November 15th every year. All the money that comes into the trust fund, the only thing the Department of Revenue can do with that money is to pay it out as a match to CPA communities. If they want to divert the money from something else, it would take a state law to do that. And it's never happened in 20 years. The money actually does not come from the state's budget. That's a misconception. For a few years, we had some supplemental money given to us from the state budget, but the primary funding source is a dedicated fee on documents filed at the Registry of Deeds. So when you go to the registry and you file a mortgage or a mortgage discharge or a deed or trust fund paperwork, whatever paperwork you're filing at the registry, there's a fee for that you pay to the state. And a portion of that fee goes into the CPA trust fund. That amount was raised recently for the first time in 20 years. We worked very hard with the legislature to pass a bill, which you're probably all familiar with, in 2019, which raised those recording fees. It used to be $20 on each document, and now it's $50. Municipal lien certificates are less, but most documents have a $50 surcharge that goes into the CPA trust fund. And that's been a game changer for us, really, in terms of the added money it's brought into the trust fund. By increasing that fee from $20 to $50, the matching money has gone up dramatically. We would have been in the single digits in terms of a match for communities unless that bill had passed. But last November, when you received your match in Fall River, you got 28.6%. And what I mean by that is 28.6% of what you raised locally. So if a community has a local surcharge for their CPA fund from their tax base of $1 million, they would have gotten a check in November for $286,000. So that's substantially higher than single digit matches, which is where we would have been if that bill hadn't passed. So it's really been terrific. And this is a great time for CPA because the match is the highest it's been in quite a long time. And all things being equal, I think the match probably will even be a tiny bit higher in November of 2021 than it was this past year, as the new fees kick in fully. We'll have a full year of collections for the new fees by November of 2021. So it wouldn't surprise me if we get to 30% or maybe even a little a little more, as long as the real estate market holds up. And the real estate market has gone crazy lately. There was just reading an article in the Sunday Globe before this meeting about how incredibly hot the real estate market is right now. And when you see a good real estate market, you know that your state match is going to be good the next year. If you see a really slow real estate market, then your state match might not be as good. We're really dependent upon how the real estate market does. And right now it's doing terrific. So those two things combined, the increase in the fees at the registry and the increase in activity at the registry, makes it a really good time to have CPA in terms of the state match.
So how has the governor been very vocal on supporting CPA?
Yes. So, one of the reasons it took so long to get that bill passed, we worked on it for 8 years to get it passed, and actually longer than that. But the final bill, final form of it, took 8 years to pass. And one of the things that keeps the legislature sometimes from passing something is they really don't want to have to face a gubernatorial veto. That just creates a showdown between the governor and the legislature. It happens, but they like to avoid it if they can. So sometimes the legislature is very careful until they get sort of a signal from the governor, and on this type of bill, particularly on money bills. And we were very pleased that a few years before it passed, Governor Baker was at a statewide conference in Massachusetts, and he came out and someone asked him about the legislation, and he said, yes, I will sign it. CPA has been terrific, and it's really important for the Commonwealth. So him coming out early and saying he would sign the bill was really what put us over the hump in terms of getting that bill passed. So he's been absolutely terrific for CPA, despite the fact that he does not live in a CPA community. He lives in Swampscott, and we actually lost our only chance to adopt CPA in Swampscott. It was 20 years ago. And Charlie Baker was actually on the Board of Selectmen in Swampscott when it was on the ballot. So, so he voted, at the selectmen's meeting to put it on the warrant for town meeting to pass and then send it to the ballot. And we always keep reminding him on that when he comes to our events at the State House. But long answer to a short question, he's been incredibly supportive, Jim. All right, so any basic questions on CPA before we kind of move on to some more specific things for CPA in your community? Any questions on the trust fund or how that works?
I have a question.
Yeah, Alex.
I might be wrong, but from what I remember, when CPA was initially adopted, the state matching funds were closer to 50%. I'm happy to hear that 2021 is looking good, but I was just wondering what you anticipate the general trend of matching funds be as more communities adopt it in the future.
Right. So actually, when CPA was first passed, remember I mentioned that it was basically a small town suburban situation. So the match was actually 100% for the first 6 years. But it was never designed to be a 100% program. And I think that was actually the worst thing that could have happened to CPA, because when it started to fall, then people were disappointed and they said, oh, the states were neging on their bargain, on their, it was supposed to be 100%. They were neging on the deal. No one ever dreamed that it would be 100%, but the real estate market went crazy back then too, because interest rates were falling and people were refinancing. And the first group of communities that passed CPA were small and didn't have a tremendous draw on the trust fund. So the match ended up being 100% for 6 years. But then as more communities joined and as the real estate market, went back to normal, the match began to fall. But for example, I'll give you a stat from the very first year of CPA Registry of Deed collections, the first full year, which would have been 2003, the trust fund brought in $53 million in 1 year. It brings in around $25 to $30 million now, and it's been in that range for a long time. So things are very different in the real estate market than they were before. If you know anything about real estate, it's hot, the prices are great, but there's not a lot of homes on the market. And CPA, it's a flat fee, so it really makes its money on volume. So the real estate market, for all it's good now, is only bringing in about half of what it used to be, which is why it was important to raise that fee to generate more funding. I do think that next year, like I said, will be a little bit higher, but then, it will trend downward. It'll trend downward very slowly. Even if we get no new communities, it'll trend downward a little bit because your local taxes go up every year. You have new growth, you have, people renovate their homes, people build new homes, new businesses come in, new office buildings are built. So your taxes go up, therefore your CPA surcharge goes up, therefore your claim on the trust fund goes up every year in every existing community. So all things being equal, even if no one new adopts CPA, if the trust fund brings in the same amount, the match is going to fall a tiny bit every year because each community puts in a bigger claim. Now that we're up to over half the communities in the state, I don't think you're going to see huge drops because new communities come in. We already have half the communities. Some communities are never going to adopt CPA. Boston is already in the program, the biggest city in the state. Springfield, the third biggest city in the state, is already in the program. Worcester is about the last big city that doesn't have CPA. But you're not going to see big hits to the trust fund because of new communities in the future. So I do think the long-term trend, is a very slow, very slight decline each year. And then, come 10 years from now, we'll be back at the legislature and we'll probably have to remind them, hey, it's been 10 years since you raised that fee. Let's not make the same mistake we went last time, which was waiting 20 years to raise it. And we'll have to advocate for, for an increase, just like anything else. Things go up, prices go up. Does that give you a little perspective on the long-term outlook?
Yes, thank you very much.
It's, even at 30% or even at 25%, if you vote yourself an override to do a project in Fall River, a general override, it doesn't come with any matching funds. So just to have that, 25% return on your money in 1 year, we'd all love to have that on our 401k or our 403b or whatever it is. That's a pretty good return. All right, anything else on the general questions? All right, so let's dive into some specific things that I think will be helpful as a refresher for all of you, but particularly for Alex and Caroline. This is probably the most important piece of CPA paper that exists. It's called the CPA Allowable Uses Chart. And hopefully you all have a copy of this. If not, it's on our website in that technical assistance section. And it's the most popular question you'll be asked, and you probably are asked, hey, could we fund this with CPA? Can CPA pay for this? And the answer is really in this chart. And you really shouldn't try to answer that question without pulling out the chart. We have a lot of CPCs that bring this chart and put it right down in the center of the table before they start any meeting. Actually, we don't have meetings with tables around tables anymore, do we? We even had one community that put it on a piece of like foam core and put it up on the wall in the meeting room. But it really is a helpful chart to tell you what you can spend CPA funds on. Everyone knows the 4 categories. You know that CPA, if it's not in the open space, historic, recreation, or housing category, you can't fund it with CPA. That's obvious. But what people don't really know innately is that it's not good enough just to be in those categories. It's only certain projects in those categories. It's not everything in the open space, historic, and recreation, and housing category. It has to be a project described by one of these verbs on the left-hand side: acquire, create, preserve, support, and rehabilitate. And you can see that not every verb is available in every category. The legislature, was pretty smart. They didn't let you create anything in the historic category. They can't create something historic. So that box is not available. You can see a dash there in the historic category. So, you need to look not only at what category the project is, but you really need to examine exactly what the money is going to be spent on, even down to looking at a budget line item by line item when you're reviewing projects. And you want to match up those costs with these verbs. Each of these verbs has a definition in the act. The actual CPA legislation is on our website. It's 17 pages long, but the rubber meets the road in section 2, which is the definitions. In most pieces of legislation, the definitions are the most important part, and these words are all defined in section 2. And you really want to work with those definitions and the budgets for the projects to determine whether it is eligible. And if you can't find a box somewhere on this chart to stuff an expense from a project, it's not eligible. You have to find a box on this project, on this chart, for every expense that you're going to spend on CPA. Not your administrative account, but I'm talking project expenses.
Stuart, can I bring up one project in particular right now?
Sure.
So we in the past have funded the entrance to the Oak Grove Cemetery in our city. The archway was repointed and brought back to its original strength, I will call it. And we also did the gates to it also. So in that cemetery, there's Lizzie Borden is buried there. So there's many notable people that are there. So there's an application for this year to put a cemetery marker in the cemetery about that gate and about the notables in the cemetery. So, I mean, I'm looking at this and it's a cemetery marker, but would that fit in any way into this?
Probably not, but let's kind of go through it. And this is a good exercise, actually. So it's obviously the historic category, right? It's a historic cemetery. So you can do 3 things in the historic category. And historic is probably the category that this applies to the most, in that there are lots of expenses that are historic in nature that don't qualify for CPA funding. You'll see it's the category that has the fewest boxes available to it. So you can only do 3 things. You can acquire a historic resource. So that's to actually buy it with CPA funds, to buy a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact. You're not buying a historic resource when you put up that sign. You can preserve a historic resource, and preserve is defined as protecting an asset from injury, harm, or destruction. So by putting up that sign, are you preserving that historic graveyard from injury, harm, or destruction? No, I wouldn't say so, right? It's more of an informational sign, interpretive sign. The last thing you can do is rehabilitate a historic asset. So when you were doing the fence and the gates, those are historic resources in and among themselves. You were rehabilitating them. You were bringing them back to their, like you said, their original glory. Replacing sections that might have been too far gone from repairing them. Whatever it took to restore those and rehabilitate those, that's what you were doing. By putting up a brand new sign, you're creating something new. So I think that really belongs in the create box. And you can see it's not available in that category. You're not acquiring, preserving, or rehabilitating a historic resource. Probably the biggest request that is not fundable in the historic category is things that have to do with interpretation. Museum displays, research projects, oral history recordings, historic brochures, I said research projects, things like that, interpretive things, which are so important, documentation. These things are all very important, but CPA can't pay for everything. It is a pretty limited funding source, and the legislature really wanted to keep it to the core projects, which is to buy things and rehabilitate things, hard assets. So, it does not seem like that sign, not knowing the full details of the project, but just from what you told me, it doesn't seem like there's a box on the allowable uses chart.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So I have a question about that sign. If it doesn't fall under historic, could it be considered under the recreation category as far as creating? Because I know recreation can be either passive or active, and because it's something that people are going to the cemetery specifically to walk around the cemetery to look for these specific locations, graveyards, notables, things like that? Could it be considered under the recreation category?
Right. So that's what we would call around the office, we would call that verb shopping. So these are verbs, right? Acquire, create, preserve, support, rehabilitate. So the way you use this chart is you find the box that really truly best describes that project. And you have to live with what it says in that box. What everyone wants to do is if they find a box or, that doesn't work, or they don't find a box at all, they go looking for another one. So, I think the sign really belongs in either the create box or the support box. That sign does support a historic resource, right? In terms of, telling you information about it. But those two boxes are unavailable. And to use this chart properly, that's where you would end. You wouldn't verb shop. You wouldn't go looking for something else that's second best to try to justify it. That's really not the way you do CPA. In the specific question where you asked, a cemetery is a historic resource. It is definitely not dedicated parkland. It's not under control of the Parks and Recreation Commission. You couldn't build a soccer field there or put in a basketball court. Cemeteries are definitely historic resources. They're not recreational resources. They're not protected by what's called Article 97 in Massachusetts, which protects all park and rec land. People might recreate in a cemetery, but the primary use is to bury dead people. So they are historic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, and we can talk about some specific projects at the end too. I think Sandy had put that on the agenda, if you guys wanted to dig into some real specific projects, but those were great questions to kind of help illustrate this chart too. Any other questions on the chart? All right. So let's move on. One of the things that I think I'd asked Sandy about this beforehand in terms of a CPA plan. A lot of the things that you might be struggling with, that a lot of CPCs struggle with, often it's because there isn't a robust CPA plan in place. So in Section 5B1 of the CPA legislation, there is a paragraph that talks about what you do when you first form your CPA community. You create a community preservation plan. And that paragraph has some of the details on how you do that. You consult with all the other boards in town. You have a public hearing to get input from the public. And you create this plan that establishes what you want your CPA program to be. And, sometimes that step is skipped or not as robust as it should be, or it is not updated. And the plan needs to be, according to the legislation, updated every year. And so when you don't have a really robust CPA plan that really digs into what you want your CPA program to be, you make yourself very reactive. You're basically now just responding to applications as they come in, and they're going to be scattered. They're going to be all over the place. And you're really not in control of what that process is. And a lot of times it can put you on your heels. You can end up with a lot of projects or a shift in your program into areas that you really, shouldn't be going into or you don't want to go into. So by having a really strong CPA plan, it makes you proactive. It signals to everybody, hey, read our plan. This is what we're looking to do with our CPA program in our community. And we're going to give tremendous, priority to applications that fit this plan. So I'll give you an example. If you were discussing housing in this plan, you'd probably have, priorities in each of the 4 areas. But if you got to the housing part of your plan, through your study and talking to all the other housing organizations in your community, you'd figure out what is the biggest need in our community. Is it family housing? Is it single family or multifamily housing? Is it senior housing? Is it housing for really low income folks, like folks at 30% or low? Is it housing for, city workers who just can't afford to buy a home in our community, they make a decent salary, maybe 80 or 100% of the area median income, but it's still not enough. So, there's a lot of different things that you can do in affordable housing, but you can't do them all. You only have a limited amount of money. I don't remember exactly how much Fall River has in your annual budget. Maybe Jim or Sandy can help me. It's maybe somewhere around a little over $1 million. Yeah.
Approximately.
So, how many affordable housing units can you build with that? You're not going to save the world with $1 million. You're not going to build 500 units of housing next year. So, rather than just being reactive to what people want to apply for, find a niche, study that and put that in your plan and sort of step back and look at those things. And, you might, uncover a huge need for senior housing. And so then your plan would say, hey, we've uncovered the biggest need in our community is for senior housing. We're going to strongly favor and encourage applications for senior housing. That doesn't mean you can't fund other things, but you're going to give more weight to people that apply with senior housing, or you're going to encourage more applications for senior housing. In the historic category, you can get applications for private assets, or you can get applications for city-owned historic assets. What's the priority? You want to study that. Some communities don't have a lot of historic municipal buildings, so they might get into the more community-based historic projects. Other communities have unbelievable historic resources, a spectacular city hall like Gloucester has, where they've put literally half of their total CPA amount into rehabbing that building.
Provincetown's another good one.
What's that?
Provincetown's another town with a lot of historic resources.
A lot of that. Their library is a historic building. Their town hall is spectacular historic. Yeah. They've both been the recipient of huge amounts of CPA money in Provincetown. So, your plan would uncover that. What's the big need here? Is it we don't have have a fairly modern town hall, a city hall, in Fall River. It's certainly not a historic building. Maybe there aren't a lot of historic municipal buildings.
Stuart, I do have a question. Historic building, that specific phrase, what is the length of time that something, how old is something when it becomes historic?
Right.
In CPA's, term.
Right. Yeah, because historic, all these terms that we talk about, they might have meaning in other places, but the meaning we go by is what's in the CPA legislation, right? So what's historic to one person is different than another person, but it only matters what it says in the CPA legislation. So that section 2 that we talked about has a definition for a historic resource. And to be a historic resource under CPA, in this case, historic buildings like we're talking about, it either A, has to be on the State Register of Historic Places, or B, your historic commission has to take a vote at one of their meetings and deem that asset significant in the history, architecture, archaeology, or culture of Fall River. So, the Lizzie Borden House, privately owned structure. The owner of that building applies for facade rehabilitation because it's falling apart. It looks terrible from the street. And it's a significant asset. Well, first you'd look and see if it's on the State Register of Historic Places. I don't know if it is or not, but let's pretend it's not. So then the applicant would go to the Historic Commission and would say, hey, I'd like to tell you all about the Lizzie Borden House and why it's significant in probably the culture of Fall River, and the history of Fall River, right? Maybe not architecture. It doesn't have some incredibly unique architectural style, and archaeology. It's not, something in the ground. So they'd make their case to the Historic Commission. The Historic Commission would take a vote. At a meeting on September 5th of the Historic Commission, we voted 6-0 to deem the Lizzie Borden House significant in the history and culture of Fall River. And they'd send a note to the CPC, and that would now be eligible for CPA funding. That doesn't mean you have to give them the money. That's just eligible for CPA funding. That means it's a historic resource under the terms of CPA, and they are eligible to apply. And then you guys decide whether it's you want to fund it or not.
So age is not necessarily the factor.
Nope, it is not a factor. That's often people think of 50 years. A lot of people say, oh, it has to be 50 years to be historic. And that does apply for some things outside of CPA. There is something called the 50-year rule, and I forget what it applies to. It has nothing to do with CPA. The CPA definition of historic is it's on the state register, or your historic commission has deemed it to be significant in one of those four things.
Yeah, because I think of our city hall as, and it's 46 years old, and I'm like looking at the 50-year mark, and I'm like, oh brother, you know.
I would not say even when that building gets to 70 years old, it's probably not going to be. You're not going to find it on the state register of historic places, probably, and you probably will not find your historic commission saying that is a significant, building in the architecture of Fall River. Now, interestingly enough, what year was that built? In the 60s?
I'd say 1975.
Yeah. Okay. So Boston City Hall was built in the same time frame.
Looks like the same architect.
Yes, except the Boston architect actually was a very famous architect, and the Boston building, is love it or hate it, it is one of the classic examples of brutalist architecture.
Oh.
It's used all over the world as a classic example, love it or hate it,
Yeah.
of what they call brutalist architecture. And Boston has a number of buildings like that. I happen to know a lot about that style of architecture, for good or for bad, because it came from the Yale School of Architecture. There was a famous architect who headed the department down there, and he kind of, that's where the brutalist movement came from. And I'm from New Haven, so there are a lot of brutalist buildings in New Haven, including the Yale School of Architecture building, which is built in that exact same style as the Department of Public Health building in Boston. There's a building in downtown with that cement with the little lines in it. It's that style of building. It's by the Garden. It's not far from Boston Garden. A huge building. That is the headquarters of the State Department of Mental Health, and the Yale School of Architecture building looks just like that building. So does that answer your question, Jim?
Yes. Thank you.
So, in talking to Sandy, it seemed like the plan in Fall River is due for an update and an upgrade. And there's a couple ways to get that done. You can hire someone from the outside to do it. Some communities, do spend some of their administrative funds to hire an outside firm to help them write a CPA plan, which is perfectly fine.
What type of a person, like, what is the title of that type of an organization or person that does that?
I think you would look for a consulting firm that does a lot of city planning, probably. There is a couple of ones that specialize in CPA plans, particularly, but in general, sometimes we've seen some of the plans in Western Massachusetts that are written by their regional planning agency. Is SERPED your regional planning agency?
Well, we have a city plan.
Yes. Yeah, we do have SERPED, Stuart.
Okay, so every state in Massachusetts has what's called a regional planning agency that serves it. There's 27 of them across the state, and SERPED, which is an acronym for Southeastern, I don't know. Sandy, help me out if you know it. But they're the regional planning agency for your part of the state. They've been actually pretty active in CPA, particularly when new communities go to adopt CPA. They are actually active in Fall River when you adopted CPA and helping to educate the community on CPA.
I think that's a good idea. I like that idea.
They might be a good source to hire them. They do projects for hire, all these regional planning agencies. Another place is, in your case, this might not really work out because I know they're incredibly overworked, but your community development and planning department, sometimes they have planners on staff who can take on that role.
Yeah, for us, that's difficult because there's only one planner. So it's quite, it's tough for him. I believe he is has a lot of work already.
Yeah, and I know that's why I said it would probably work in your case.
New Bedford, I think, has 4 planners.
Right. And they have like a specific historic preservation planner,
Yeah.
for example. And then in smaller communities, the 9 members of the committee get together, and they each take a different section of it and they write that. We don't see that as much in real larger communities that have more resources to hire someone from the outside. But it really can help to have a really robust plan. And one of the things I think I've noticed in a lot of the applications that have come to Fall River CPA program, they seem to sometimes be on the fringes of CPA, not at the core projects of CPA. And so that's why sometimes you just struggle with these applications because you really don't know what to do with them or try to fit them into like a square peg in a round hole because they're not the core of what CPA is all about. They might be legal, but that doesn't mean they're, the best things to use your CPA funds are. And so having a plan with these priorities clearly identified will definitely help you in the future. So that's something that I can recommend. Any questions on that? We should move on.
Yep.
All right. So Sandy wanted to talk a little bit about applications too. Every community has their own local application process, and that's completely up to you guys. There's nothing in the law. It doesn't even say you need applications. By the way, that's Provincetown Town Hall. Look at that, Jim. You're like, what do they call that? You're a psychic. You can see the future.
Great building.
Yeah, and that was a top to bottom rehabilitation with CPA, 100%. Spectacular building, and you see it as soon as you get off the ferry in Provincetown.
Yeah.
So in any case, that's interesting. It's telling me my computer's about to die because it's not plugged in, but it is plugged in. That is quite interesting. All right, so I don't leave you in the middle of this presentation. Give me a second to make a switch here. Jim, you want to vamp or sing or do a little dancing or something while I...
I don't think you'd want me to do any of those.
Okay. Plug it directly in here. No, that is quite interesting. There we go. All right. At one of our statewide conferences, I was giving the keynote presentation in front of 200 people and had forgot to plug in the laptop that was powering the PowerPoint. And all of a sudden, there it was gone. And I had forgotten to bring my cord to the meeting as well. So we beg, borrow, and steal a cord from someone who had the same model laptop in the audience. So sorry about that. All right. Do you guys use a 2-step application process, by the way? You do,
Yes.
don't you? Yeah. By 2-step meaning this was developed in Oak Bluffs. They were the first CPC to think of this, and now it's really spread everywhere. It's a great idea where someone, you don't want someone to spend a lot of time developing a full application and submitting it only to find out it's not legal to fund that project. So, the first is just a very simple form that someone submits to find if they're eligible, and then the full application comes once you declare them eligible. So when you have someone submit that first eligibility application or your final one thing we see that people make the mistake of a lot on their applications is they put the 4 boxes and they say, check all the categories that apply. Now, the natural inclination of an applicant is, the more boxes I check, the better chance I have of getting funded. So people just willy-nilly check, 3 out of the 4 categories. It's a park that I want to rehabilitate. It's been around for a long time, so it must be historic as well. And open space, yeah, parks are open space. So they want to apply to rehabilitate a park. They check historic, open space, and recreation. And that's not the way you want to do it. You want to force people in almost all cases to pick the primary category, because each category of CPA has different rules that follow that category. And if you don't know what category your project is in, you don't know what set of rules to apply to that project. For example, if a project is in the historic category, well, the work has to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. Those are the standard historic guidelines. If it's in the recreation category, it can only be an outside project. You can't, so if someone applied, some of these old town halls actually have, big rooms in them with basketball courts. I've been to 2 town halls that used in the old days, their main meeting room was also their indoor basketball court. And so someone applies in the recreation category, to do that. Well, that's not a recreation project under CPA because CPA is only for outdoor recreation. The only way that could qualify is if it was a historic building.
But
So
should the CPA be more favorable in projects that fit 2 categories? Like, for instance, one of the categories that we have funded was for the Dr. Fisk House in Fall River, it's an underground railroad site. It was built in 1833, and it was funded under housing and preservation. So should the CPC be favorable in a project that fits 2 categories more than one?
right. So that, honestly, the original thinking of CPA was, projects that are in more categories, the more categories it fits, the better. In reality, it just hasn't worked out that way. Really, the only example that I can think of that you see a lot is the one you just described, a historic building that is being rehabbed into housing. That is truly in 2 categories. It's about the only example that we see on a regular basis that truly is 2 categories. People confuse recreation and open space all the time. Those are completely different. Open space is conservation land, fields, forests, your bioreserve, farms, ocean fronts, wetlands. That's conservation land is what open space is. Recreation is active stuff, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, community gardens, trails, things like that. So that's the one example, Jim. And in those cases, you usually want to consider them as a historic project, if you can, because that building, no matter whether it's being rehabbed for housing or offices or whatever, it doesn't matter what it's being rehoused for. If it's a truly historic building, you want to make sure it's done right. You want to make sure it's done according to the Secretary of Interior standards. So this is a perfect example. If you, try to do that in both housing and historic, do the Secretary of Interior standards apply? Who knows? Because maybe it's a housing project where they don't apply.
Oh, yeah.
So on those, I usually tell folks, if it's a significant historic building, make it a historic project. Declare it historic and say that's how you're applying. Tell the applicant, we're considering this as a historic project because we want to make sure when you do that building over, you do it right. You maintain the historical integrity of the building. If you take that application as a housing project, the applicant could destroy everything that's historic about that building when they have it. And you could still fund it because you can fund affordable housing, but do you really want to destroy everything that's historic about that building while you do that? Probably not.
Good point.
So,
Stuart, I have a question. When you brought up recreation,
yes.
You said recreation is active stuff. What if you were replacing lights on a ball field in a park?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
It's a ball field. That's active recreation. It's outdoors. Lights are a capital improvement. They're affixed to the ground. With recreation, you can't do things that are, not capital improvements on the ground. So you can't buy the movable soccer nets or the balls, or the bats, but things that are affixed to the ground that are commonly, used in a park or a athletic area. Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
So that is an active recreation project. Sometimes the neighbors aren't too happy about lights going in, but that's another story. So that's one suggestion I can make for your application process. The other thing that I think people miss the opportunity with a 2-step application process, there's really that first application that you get, the description of the project and to determine the eligibility, whether it's legal or not, that can really serve 2 purposes. The first is what we just said. tell the person whether it's legal and whether they should, submit a full application. But don't miss the opportunity to do the second thing, which is to tell the applicant at that time, hopefully in writing, exactly what you want to see in that application. Great, your project is eligible. You're the Conservation Commission, you're applying to buy a piece of open space. Great, that is an eligible CPA expense. When you submit your full application, make sure you have an appraisal in there. B, a map of the property. C, letters of support from all the abutters. So we know it's a popular project and we're not going to, we're not stepping into a controversy. We want to see a copy of the purchase and sale agreement that you've signed with the owner. We want to see, evidence of an environmental study that's been done, to make sure there's no contamination on the property. I'm making these things up, but what the point is how many times, you've gotten an application and it just doesn't have half the things you really want to know about that application.
Correct.
Nothing's missing. It's just, someone is going to put, unless you force them, they're going to put the least amount of effort into doing that. Applying for funds is hard.
One of the biggest problems we've had is people getting estimates for projects, whatever they may be, and then some come in with like none again.
Right. So, and that's another thing, right? So if it's a historic project, we're going to want to see it, an estimate. Don't just get back to the applicant and say, yes, it's eligible for funding. Send us your application. Get back to them, say it's eligible for funding, and make sure all these things are in this application. And you can even have at your meeting, when you determine the eligibility, and get back to them, do you discuss that as a group or is that done like at the staff level by Sandy?
We discussed it as a group.
Okay, great. So if you're discussing it as a group, someone, you come to a consensus that it's eligible, or if you take a vote, I don't know how you do it, but then go around the room and say, okay, let's all think of what questions we have about this project. What things do we want to see? And go around the room and have everyone, make a list that, Sandy takes down all the information, think out loud. Gee, I'd like to know if there's contamination on that property. I've hiked there before and I've kind of seen trash and, some barrels there. I'd like to see if there's ever been a contamination study done on it. Whatever it is you want to see, put it down in writing. And then when you get back to the person, say, your project's eligible. And your application is only going to be considered complete if it has these things in it. We want to see these things. Because your application, it's a general application. It can't cover, it asks for a lot of things, but it's a general application. It can't cover the specific things that you needed for each type of project, right?
Sure.
If you're going to do that, you'd have to have a specific project for land purchases, a specific application for private historic building rehabs, a specific application for acquiring land for open space. I mean, you're not going to have 30 different versions of your application. You can't detail all the, the things you'd want to know about it in a general application. So that's why having an outline of the project in front of you can now steer you to making sure when that application comes in, it's complete. And by putting it in writing, if they submit that application, and Sandy goes through it even before your meeting and says, okay, we asked for 6 things to be attached as an addendum. Only 2 of them are there. You kick the application back. You don't even accept it. Say this is not a complete application. As we said in our letter on September 22nd, we need these 4 other things, or, a paragraph explaining why you don't have those things,
That makes sense.
And then the last thing is, I think you also hinted at this in item H on the agenda, emergency funding. I see a lot of communities get themselves backed into a corner because they don't leave themselves enough time to evaluate the application. And as you can see, the process I just described, I just complicated your life and lengthened your time that you need to evaluate an application. If you're going to ask for all that information, it might take a while for the applicant to pull that all together. or they might submit it and stuff's missing and you have to kick it back to them and they have to go back and redo it and add that information, or someone has to track down that information. So, you really want to have a deadline for your eligibility application and your final application, 9 months ahead of when you are going to the city council with your recommendation, 6, 8 months at the very minimum. September is a good time to kick it off. I just am working with a community that has a project application due on February 1st. And they've asked, for some technical assistance. And I'm like, you need this resolved in a month. The warrant is closing for town meeting. It has to be a town. You don't have enough time to do this properly, to gather all the information.
So if that's the case, if it doesn't come through, would a good idea be, you know what, you're not going to make it this year, but you know what, work on this harder and reapply next year?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want that to be, you don't want to have to tell them that if you didn't require their, application to come in till January 1st, that was on you guys. You didn't have a long enough period for them to really work on responding to your questions. But, I would set an early application deadline and then adhere to it, because when stuff comes in late, that's where mistakes are made. That's where the political pressure starts to be applied to you, and you don't really have enough time to properly vet a project, and you're getting pressure to approve it quickly, and you're getting pressure to approve it before you're really comfortable with it, and whether you really have the information you need. So that doesn't mean that you can't have a policy for late applications. A lot of communities do. There are some things, that are true emergencies or are truly, could not have been known at the time your application deadline was due. So
sorry to interrupt you. On our agenda here, in the topics for discussion, which letter are you on?
I'm skipping all around, Jim.
All right, so that's okay. All right, all right, that's okay. All right. So,
H.
And the reason, this particular topic is H, but the reason I'm doing that is this list was in no particular order, and I'll
okay.
do it in a more
I
logical.
also just want the public to know that also. I know what you're doing, but I want our public to know that, because
Right.
Emergency funding has been, contentious is not the right word, but it's been challenging, and it's been heavily debated on what's an emergency project. And I don't even think I 100% know. We all know if the tornado ripped the roof off, that's an emergency. That's a pretty simple emergency. It's the other ones that come in as emergency that we really fluctuate on. Is this an emergency or is this not an emergency? And I don't know how to define that particular phrase, emergency funds.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at it. I actually would toss that word emergency out. That's not a good reason to accept. It might be one of the reasons, but it's not the primary reason. CPA is not an emergency funding source. Your finance committee reserve account, your free cash, your stabilization fund in the city of Fall River, those are designed for emergencies. CPA is a long-range quality of life improvement program. It's not the piggy bank for quick action.
Yeah.
The process.
I actually think that every single preservation project is an emergency funding project.
The historic category, everyone's going to tell you it's an emergency.
I actually believe that's true, because all of these historic properties are kind of falling down. So
Yeah.
I think they're all an emergency.
Right.
If you really look at it that way,
Right. That's just not the type of funding source CPA is. It's really much more, you create a long range plan. What are the real quality of life priorities, and how can we now build those priorities? It's not a reactive emergency funding source. Like I said, there are 3 municipal finance sources for those sort of things, because emergencies come up all the time in running a city.
Yeah.
That's why a city has a stabilization fund, a FinCom reserve, and free cash. You don't have any of those things. And your process doesn't lend itself to that. So the word emergency is not a good reason for late applications. Although, the tornado off the roof, that's a different story. That would, if it's unforeseen, all the other historic preservation emergencies are deferred maintenance, Jim.
Yeah. That
Right?
makes sense. Yep.
It's become an emergency because of deferred maintenance.
Yep.
you guys don't want to have to be, putting yourself under undue stress and agita, and
And we
ripping.
do. And it totally is. You're 100% right with that phrase, because it is stress on the board. And because it's kind of like tugging at your heartstrings. You feel bad about this building. But like you say, it's not our responsibility for like lack of maintenance and on the municipality.
Right. And or private assets too. That doesn't mean you can't do those projects, and it doesn't mean that they're not valuable projects. But you shouldn't you shouldn't revolve your program around those. And you really want to train everyone again that CPA is a long range capital improvement quality of life program. Thinking big, not necessarily just running around putting a roof here, doing those sort of that's what the general budget is for, or private fundraising or whatever. So the one that does come up the most often that really does lend itself very well to late applications is acquiring land.
Yeah.
You don't really do a ton of that in Fall River, but I know the water department is always trying to acquire more land or conservation restrictions on land to protect the water quality, which is really important in a core CPA project. Usually those projects just do not follow any, normal, you just never know when Farmer John is going to put his property up for sale or when he's going to die and his kids decide to put the property up for sale. And with land purchases, the owner's not going to wait around forever, to wait. You can't say to them what you said to the other people, which is, get your ducks in a row and come back, see us a year from now. The landowner's not going to wait that long to sell his property. So land is probably the best example of a good reason to take a late application. If something has just come on the market and the Conservation Commission really wants to look at it for CPA, or the Rec Commission wants to look at it for rec, or the Housing Authority wants to look at it for housing, or the Water Department for conservation. Those sort of things truly are a good example. But there really aren't too many others. And so you really want to be very strict about deadlines, because you will cause yourself a lot of, this is supposed to be the best, most fun board in town. It's not a regulatory board, it's whoever sits on the planning board and the conscom here. Sometimes those meetings aren't fun, right? Regulatory boards, Board of Health, those boards are tough.
Yeah.
CPA is the fun board, it's the quality of life, it's the dream big, it's the make the city better board. And so, by its nature, you shouldn't be having a ton of pressure and stress put on you for, a late application from someone, because they didn't have their act together and they're thinking short term. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we also wanted to talk about the anti-aid amendment. So we've kind of handled, applications, eligibility, emergency funding. So now let's get into like some of the actual nuts and bolts of types of projects. And really, CPA projects fall into two categories: municipal resources and non-municipal resources. And they're both eligible for funding. Although I will tell you, when the legislature created CPA, it was thinking municipal projects. I don't think the legislature ever imagined that CPA would fund as many non-municipal entities that it does. And because it's turned into a big industry for CPA to fund non-municipal projects. But there is this little, hitch in the idea of doing that called the anti-aid amendment. And I won't go into the full history of it. We do have a great article on our website in the technical assistance section. It's called "Can CPA Fund Private Projects?" And it actually has a copy of the wording of the anti-aid amendment and the whole history. But it's a very old amendment to our state's constitution from the 1800s. It's not even a law, so it's not something that can be changed by the legislature. Laws cannot override amendments to our state's constitution. And this is an amendment.
Just to interrupt for 1 second. Sorry, Stuart. This is in the documentation that Sandy sent to us. So we have that what you're talking about is in our documentation right now.
Yeah, it's 6D
Yeah.
item on the agenda. And by the way, I would say that, you know, when you do a training you know, type of meeting, really the whole point of training is for interactive and for questions and that sort of thing. So it's the first time I've actually seen specific topics listed, you know, on an agenda like that. I think for a training, it's very permissible to ask whatever you need to know. I mean, that's the whole point. You know, I attend your meeting once every 4 years or whatever. So I think you're good, but I definitely have tried to structure it the same way Sandy did. So basically what the amendment says is, you know, CPA is public money, and you can give it to a private organization, but it can't be for private benefit. It has to be for public benefit. So, you know, these are 3 privately owned buildings in 3 municipalities that have all received CPA funding, but all 3 of them have clear public benefit, even though they're not owned by the city or town. In the bottom right corner, you might recognize that. It's the only one on the South Shore. It's the Abigail Adams House, so the birthplace of Abigail Adams, the wife of our president. And it's owned by the Abigail Adams Society, and it is an incredibly popular historic museum and an incredibly important building. The Abigail Adams birthplace. And that was rehabbed, the exterior, with CPA funds.
So that's a private residence?
No, it's not a private residence. It's a former private residence. Now it's owned by the Abigail Adams Society. So a nonprofit 501c3 that operates it as a museum, open to the public, and very visible, and a huge historic resource to preserve because of the importance of the building. The Academy of Music, you might recognize that if you've ever been to Northampton. It's basically their concert hall, their local concert hall, but it is right on the main drag. It is right next to City Hall. There is no more prominent building as you come up the hill in Northampton than that facade of that building. I mean, that makes downtown Northampton, that beautiful facade of that building. Clearly, it's an iconic building, beautiful architecture. It's really the hub of all activity in Northampton, and the facade was rehabbed with CPA funds. The top right is in Westfield, Massachusetts. It's a former whip factory. And by whip, I mean horse and buggy whip. What is Fall River's nickname? The blank city. What are you?
The Spindle City was one of the names that we used to be called. We've had many names. Caroline, would you know, Caroline, the Spindle City is one that we've had our name.
I think that's probably the major one.
And where did that come from, Caroline?
From the amount of cotton textile mills we had.
Okay. All right. Well, Westfield is the whip city because at one point they had 9 whip factories. Now, that was a long time ago when horse and buggy whips were big, but they had 9 whip factories. This is the only one that's left, and it is an actual, they do still make horse whips here. But more importantly, it's a beautiful, iconic historic building, the last remaining whip factory in the Whip City. And they're turning it into the first floor into a museum of the Whip City history. And CPA funds, you know, that you can see there, the exterior needs a little bit of work. I don't have an after picture. I should get one. But a terrific CPA project. Again, all 3 of these, public money being given to a private organization, but clearly to the public benefit. Now, if these folks had asked for money, not for their facade or even preserving the historic fabric of the building, but if they had asked for money for new carpeting for the executive offices that are in the back that aren't open to the public, well, there's not much public benefit to that project, right? So it's still the same thing. It's public money going to this iconic building, privately owned, but it's not really for public benefit. It's for private benefit. You know, it really benefits the organization and their structure and their offices and their employees. So that's the litmus test that you face every time you give money to a non-municipal entity. You have to figure out what is the public benefit? And it can be a use, it can be, of historic facade that defines, the city. It can be the acquisition of a restriction. That's another way, believe it or not, to guarantee the public benefit is when you acquire a historic preservation restriction on a historic building or a conservation restriction on a piece of private open land, or a agricultural preservation restriction on a privately owned farm. Those restrictions are actually what they call real property interests. You actually own a piece of that property. The city of Fall River, if they own the restriction, they own a piece of that property. And that is to the public benefit. Now the public owns something. They own a historic preservation restriction on the facade of the Academy of Music, owned by the citizens of Northampton. So, there's a lot of ways to guarantee public benefit. The anti-aid amendment doesn't tell you how to guarantee public benefit. That's something for you and your city solicitor to figure out. Sometimes it's obvious, like with these three are more obvious. Other times you've been asked for probably more privately owned commercial building historic work than anyone else in the state. I very rarely see those type of projects across the state in CPA communities because it's so much harder to define the public benefit of those kind of projects. But you guys get a lot of those types of applications and they're difficult. They're really difficult. And they're difficult because of this. It's this issue of how do you give away public money to a private organization and not have it be for private benefit. So and there's no easy answer to this. It is a case by case basis. So any questions on that?
No.
Okay.
Thank you for that explanation, though.
No problem. So I mentioned one of the ways to guarantee public benefit, and probably the best way to guarantee public benefit on a private building or property, is to get a deed restriction on that property. And there are two ways a deed restriction might play into a CPA project and be valuable. The first is anytime you acquire something with CPA funds, you are required by the law to have a permanent deed restriction placed on that property, forever keeping it as what it is. So let's go back for a second to the allowable uses chart. See that top box, acquire? Another reason why you need to stuff a CPA project in the box, remember I said what rules follow the project? The rules that follow a project come from what box it's in. Well, if you acquire a piece of open space, you need a conservation restriction on that open space. If you acquire a historic building, which is not that common, but it does happen, you need a historic preservation restriction on that property. If you acquire land to build a park or a new athletic field or a rail trail, you need a conservation restriction on that property. If you acquire land to build affordable housing or an apartment building to turn into affordable housing, you need a restriction on that. And by acquire, I mean the city is acquiring it, not some private entity. But if the city is acquiring one of these things, you would have to place a permanent deed restriction on it. And the reason is, CPA is a restricted funding source. It's restricted to these four categories. And they wanted to make sure that CPA wasn't used to supplement the general fund of Fall River. So they didn't want the community buying a piece of open space on the north side of town. But in the back of the mind of the city councilors, they're like, we're going to need a new school on the north side of town in 10 or 15 years. That's the growing part of town. We're going to need an elementary school up there. Let's acquire this land. Let's use CPA money so we don't have to raise our taxes and use our general fund. Let's buy this piece of land that just came for sale in the north part of town. We'll call it CPA open space. And then if we need a new school up there, we'll build the school there. Well, that's not what CPA is for. That's not what your citizens voluntarily voted themselves a tax increase for. They voted it for these four areas as a restricted fund for these four areas. So if you buy that open space, it needs a conservation restriction, and it needs a permanent conservation restriction that locks that land down as conservation land forever. That's the idea of CPA. But it's only required when you use this top box, when you acquire something.
So the historic preservation restriction is not necessary if you're preserving an historic resource?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
We're first at when it's absolutely required. We'll go back to that slide now, and you'll see there's two types of places where a deed restriction might play into your projects. The first is when it's required. The second is when it's optional. So any questions on the first one? Not all that common for Fall River. You don't buy a lot of real estate with CPA funds, although some of the water company projects, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yep.
And so those are, restrictions are necessary. But a lot of communities, this is the main part of their CPA program. In the little town I live on the North Shore, I was chairing my CPC for 5 years. We never met a piece of open space that we didn't want to buy. If something comes on the market, we're buying it with CPA funds. So, we have conservation restrictions on all these properties all over town that we've bought over the 20 years.
Swansea, which is 2 towns over from us, is doing a lot of that too.
They buy a lot of agricultural preservation restrictions on farms in
Yeah.
Swansea. Very popular, and open space as well. All right, so when else might a deed restriction intersect with a CPA project? Well, at the CPC's option, they might feel that for one reason or another, a property that is going to receive CPA funds needs a restriction on it. And that's the example you gave, Jim. Okay. If you are asked to give money to a private project and you have to guarantee the public benefit, the deed restriction might be the best way to do that. So that may be a situation where you say, we're going to give you the funds for this project, but you're going to give the city back a preservation restriction on that building. When a land trust comes to you and says, we want to buy this piece of, open space, actually, that's a required one. Sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors here. Another optional situation, we've had a few situations where even a city asset, the city's come and said, we have this old Grange Hall that the city owns, and we want to rehab it with CPA funds. Well, the CPC in that case knew that for 10 years, the town's been talking about selling that Grange Hall. And instead of selling it, the selectmen decided to apply for $1 million to fix it up. But the CPC was not trusting that building was going to, that the selectmen weren't just going to get the CPA money, fix it up, and now it's worth a lot more, and they were going to sell it. So the CPC said, sure, we'll give you $1 million to rehab that building, but you're going to put a preservation restriction on it. So if you do sell it, it's going to have that preservation restriction that's going to go with the building, and that'll keep it looking historic forever. And that was the main goal, was to save the building and keep it looking just like it was. So, there's a lot of situations, particularly in the historic category, when giving money to a private organization, where you're going to feel that even though it's not required by CPA, it's something that you want to make it as a condition of the project. Now, there are 2 types of restrictions: permanent ones, which means more than 30 years, and restrictions that last less than 30 years. Why 30 years? Why this 30-year thing? Well, in Massachusetts state law, not CPA law, Massachusetts general law, if a restriction is going to be for more than 30 years, it has to have the approval of the state and be signed by the secretary of that state agency. So if you buy land for housing and you need a preservation housing restriction on that, it has to be signed by the secretary of Department of Housing and Community Development. So the only way to permanently restrict land for more than 30 years from Massachusetts is for the state to agree and to look over the restriction. And that's because forever is a long time, right? And we're not all going to be here forever, but you put a restriction on it that's permanent, the state wants to look at that document and make sure it's going to stand the test of time. And it has to be approved by the state and signed by the secretary. That can be a big deal. It can take a long time to get that process done. You don't have a choice when you're acquiring something with CPA money. The law requires a permanent restriction. But when you're just doing it at your option, maybe to satisfy the anti-aid amendment or for the situation I described where you want to make sure a building is preserved in the future, um, you might not need a permanent restriction because going through Mass Historic Commission to get a permanent historic restriction is a big deal and it takes a long time and it's expensive. So there's also term restrictions, meaning for a term less than 30 years. And those can be really helpful for smaller projects, right? If you're asked for, $30,000 to redo the front beautiful steps of, a local historic museum, historic building. Well, to tell the museum, we're going to give you $30,000 to fix up the front steps and restore them, but you need to give us a permanent restriction on the whole building. And that's going to take 2 years and cost $40,000 in legal fees. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? And to ask them to restrict their whole building for $30,000, you're asking them to give up a lot, to put a permanent restriction on their building forever. So a term restriction can be perfect in that case. In that case, you don't have to go to Mass Historic. So it's just an agreement between the city and the landowner. It's a lot less time. You can make it say whatever you want. The state doesn't have to approve the wording. And you can make it be for 10 years or 20 years. And by then the steps are probably going to have to be redone anyways. So the city got the value that it wanted by protecting that asset for the duration of the useful life of the improvement that the city made. So these optional restrictions, it's up to the CPC and it's up to you whether they'd be permanent or a term restriction.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
what if there's an historic property and, roof was leaking terribly, they applied for funds and we gave them funds for a roof. And then, so they got the funds. 2 years later, you look at the building and all of a sudden you see, windows that were there are now aluminum windows.
Well, that's why it might be a good idea if you give them a significant amount of money for a roof that you get a historic preservation restriction on that building. That's a good example because that would prohibit them from doing that, wouldn't it? The historic preservation restriction would be enforced by the city. Probably the historic commission would own that restriction and be overseeing that property, and they wouldn't let that happen. So yeah, you give them the money, especially if it's a private organization, you have absolutely no control over what they do. They could rip off the wood siding and put vinyl siding on that building. So that's why, particularly with private projects, you've got to be, it's very hard, to prevent that from happening. And that's why restrictions are really one of the only ways you can, protect the public's interest when you give money to a private organization like that.
Yeah, and then obviously the applicant should be told that as you're going through the process with them.
If you spring that at them after, the city council votes and you say, okay, we're about to cut you your check, here's the agreement you have to sign, that is not a good way to do business. It should say, right up front.
Right, during the process.
Yep, absolutely. You want to, and maybe that's a good discussion you have as part of your preliminary review when you get back to the person. You say, yes, you're invited, your project is legal, you're invited to apply. Here's the things we want to see with your application, and be aware that this is going to trigger a restriction of some type on the building that we'll have to negotiate, whether it's permanent or a term restriction or what it's going to say, but we're not going to give money to this project without protecting that building for the future. So in Plymouth, obviously they have tons of historic properties in Plymouth. And Plymouth, there's, I don't know if it's in their CPA plan. It probably is, but their whole program, what their goal is to get as many buildings under restriction as possible to protect the character of Plymouth as a historic. They don't want all these historic buildings being torn down and changing the character of the town. So, they really don't care about, putting a new roof on your historic building or a new facade or whatever, they could care less about that. What they want is the restriction.
Mm.
So, they buy restrictions on buildings, they give the money, you have to value how much that restriction is worth by an appraisal, and then they give the money. They don't care what the landowner does with that money. Their goal was to get that restriction, which is now owned by the town of Plymouth, and protects that building from looking historic, and it protects, the character of the town. So
So
you
on
know,
those, in what you're talking about, who is putting in the application for those restrictions? Like what department of the city of Plymouth is doing that?
okay, well, that is a local operational procedure, and every town operates so differently. You talked about, New Bedford has a robust planning department with 4 people. Fall River has 1 overworked person. So that really depends. There's no standard answer to that. You know, in New Bedford, it would definitely be, they have a full-time historic preservation planner, and I'm sure Anne, who's their preservation planner, who happens to be on our steering committee, I'm sure she is controlling that process, start to finish.
She's so good.
But she's a full-time historic preservation planner, who used to also be the Sandy of the CPC. She's not any longer, but so when those projects came in, you could make sure that, she was on that restriction, she was writing that restriction, she was negotiating with the landowner, getting Mass Historic to sign off. It was a permanent restriction, making sure it got filed. She was doing all that. You
Mhm.
don't have that resource, so it's a lot harder for you. And it also, that you might have to factor that into the type of projects you can do. You don't have that structure for overseeing these private historic projects. You need an infrastructure for that. You need, whether the CPC is going to hire someone who's a professional in that, um, either as on retainer, or as a part-time employee, in the and supporting the CPC, but you don't have that type of infrastructure in Fall River. It makes those projects very hard for you to do.
Mm.
Whereas Boston, they're like a machine for those type of projects. New Bedford, same thing. On the other hand, your water department and that whole way they protect land and restrictions on it, that is the envy of the whole state. Fall River is the envy of the whole state. So you might be lacking in that historic preservation in your planning department, but as far as protecting land and protecting your watershed and protecting your water quality and making sure those restrictions are written and they're buttoned up, you've got the best in the state running that operation in Fall
They're
River.
a really good department to work with.
Yep. So, it might not be exactly what maybe everyone wants to do with their CPA funds, but your funds are limited, and so you've got to live within your means and figure out what things are feasible for you to do and do them good, and so it might mean in Fall River, you're going to spend more of your money, in that regard. And the CPA program in Fall River is going to be a drinking water quality protection fund, just like in Plymouth, it's the acquire historic restrictions on every building in town fund.
Hmm.
And in Gloucester, it's the fix up our iconic city hall fund. Find out what you're good at, and what things could have a real impact, and where the real need is. I know that those acquisitions by the water department are really hard to fund. Like there's just not a lot of money out there for that beyond CPA. So, you've got to, and this is part of your plan, right? This
Yeah,
is what,
that's the other great thing about the water department. They always try and find some sort of matching funds to help the project along. I mean, they've been really, really good at that. Mike Labasi has been phenomenal at doing that. And
Yep.
you see that, it's like, wow, you're really working at this.
Right. But yet your program, the vast majority of your applications, or not the vast majority, but a large percentage of your applications, more than any other CPC in the state, are for private commercial buildings. And you have no structure to manage that in Fall River. You have no people that have that expertise. You have no city departments to help with that. You have no history, you can't go to the file and say, okay, we got 40 historic restrictions. Oh, this is very similar to the one we did in 1976 with the Johnson building, cut and paste, I mean, you just don't have that culture or that infrastructure or that type of support. And so it makes those projects messy and difficult to do. And I sometimes you struggle with those types of projects because they're out of the, you're out of your element a little bit, in terms of the support you have and the culture and the staffing of the city and the tradition of types of things the city does. So it's a great example. It's that dichotomy that exists on the historic versus the open space. Every city has things they're good at and things they're not so good at. Everyone has, and you have one that you're really excellent at and one that's, more difficult. So, I mean, Springfield, has a really good historic structure. It's mostly through a strong volunteer and a lot of historic neighborhood associations and a strong historical society and a really strong historic commission, so they don't have a lot of staff support, but they have a lot of long-term volunteers who really make it sing there, make their historic preservation program sing. They're probably the closest that I've seen in terms of the number of types of projects that they get, but they really have a great infrastructure for making sure those projects are done and managed. So one last thing about restrictions. One entity cannot own both the fee ownership in an asset and the restriction. So what do I mean by that? And this is not CPA law, this is state law. If the city owns a piece of conservation land, they cannot also own the restriction. A third party, like a land trust or the Buzzards Bay Association Coalition, they have to own the restriction. The whole idea of a restriction is someone is watching over that property and is going to notice if something wrong is done, right? If it's a piece of open space and a building is built, or something, the town uses it as a dump. If it's a historic building and the landowner decides to blow out the beautiful old wooden windows rather than rehabilitating them and putting in vinyl replacement windows. The idea of the restriction is there's an organization overseeing and watching what's going to happen with that asset and making sure it stays true to the category it's in, whether it's historic housing. If it's a housing unit that's affordable, they're going to make sure that it stays affordable, and when the house is sold, it's going to be sold to a new affordable owner. It's not going to go market rate. And so if the city was owning that conservation land and they were also owning the restriction, that's not going to work, right? The city's not going to sue itself. Who in the city is going to, stop the city from using that land as a dump or building a building on it, right? So there's always two separate parties that own those things. One owns the asset, the building or the land. Another owns the restriction. And that can make it, again, a little tricky. So with these private buildings, a property owner owns the building, the city can own the restriction, right? But they can't be one and the same. So if the city's going to own an asset they've acquired with CPA funds, someone else has to own the restriction, and they're going to watch over the city's use of that property.
So Stuart, I have, it's a two-part question, and it would relate to this. So the city, one of the city properties that we've given CPA funds to is Oak Grove Cemetery.
Mhm.
And that's a historic property. So the way that we had originally planned it when we do the historic deed restrictions is that the historical commission is going to own the restriction. But in that case, it's a city-owned property because it's a cemetery, and the historical commission is a city commission. So
They can't do it.
okay.
Is the cemetery definitely owned by the city? Because a lot of cemeteries are of unknown ownership. These older cemeteries, sometimes, there's the owner.
Well, it is.
It is.
It
Okay.
is.
So if it is a city cemetery, the historic commission cannot hold that restriction. So it needs to be a third party, and those third parties are sometimes tough to find. In the land industry, they're not. You know, land trusts hold restrictions all over the state, local land trusts like Buzzards Bay Coalition. In the historic world, it's a little harder. And in the recreation world, it's really hard to find someone to hold a restriction on active recreation land like a park or an athletic field. So, you know, a lot of times, if a town has a private historical society, they'll own restrictions. Some statewide organizations will, you know, like,
Can the Fall River Preservation Society own restrictions?
isn't that like your local historical society?
No.
Okay. Tell me about the Fall River Preservation Society.
Alex, you wanna? Speak a bit?
It's just it's a local nonprofit. It's geared more towards historic properties and architecture.
And do they,
Historical Society, Caroline might want to correct me, but is geared more towards artifacts and local history, storytelling, that sort of thing.
oh, you're so lucky to have two organizations like that. Okay. So tell me, does the preservation group own any actual buildings or property or anything?
Yes.
They do.
One.
Okay, perfect. Absolutely. That is the perfect organization to hold a historic preservation restriction on a city asset. Now, it is a little unusual to have a preservation restriction on a cemetery, I think. That's a good question for Mass Historic. There's not a heck of a lot of danger that a cemetery is going to be used for something else or sold, right? So who's requiring the restriction on the Oak Grove Cemetery?
We as a CPC had decided that we were going to do that for any historic property. The problem with Oak Grove Cemetery that we've had, as far as with the historical commission, even that we've had, even though they're not going to, you know, knock things down and build houses and stuff, the cemetery itself was designed in the same manner as Mount Auburn Cemetery. It was designed to be a park-like cemetery with the winding roads, very historic. And what's happened is, as the cemetery is expanding, they've moved to a grid design. It's losing all sense of historic identity. And they want to do a new section of the cemetery now. And again, they're doing the same thing. They want to build this big wall of stones. They want all the stones to be the same size, the same basic shape. It's going to be like a wall of headstones, and anything where the historic identity was originally created in that cemetery is going to be gone. I mean, one whole section of it is completely gone. So that's the problem in that particular cemetery.
Right.
Not necessarily in others, but in that. So
Yeah, so that's a unique situation where you looked at it and said, we think a historic preservation restriction will help in that case, you know, further the goal of historic preservation. So, yeah, I mean, normally you wouldn't be worried about a cemetery being sold by the city or anything bad happen to it. People are not going to go remove the headstones in a cemetery. You know, there's no buyers for cemeteries. You know, normally you wouldn't need to protect that if it was a city-owned asset, but that's a unique situation, and that's a very good reason, you know.
well, we actually had destruction in the cemetery because the park board who oversees the cemeteries had voted to let them remove old planters and things like that, and they went in and just completely decimated some of these old graves and removed planters that had been there for 50 plus years. And so, and a lot of these things have never been put back. There was a whole big uproar in the city about this. And so this was one of the reasons why we wanted the preservation restriction. But we also don't know, because it was done, we funded the gate, the main archway and the gates on the cemetery. So does the preservation restriction have to go just on the gate, or is it on the cemetery? Because the cemetery itself is the property.
Right. Okay. So this goes back to Oh, it goes back to what's on the screen right now. Um, so, if a restriction is going to be permanent, meaning more than 30 years, you're going to need to go through Mass Historic Commission. And they would be the determination of the answer to that question. And they may not be willing to hold a preservation restriction just on the gate. So, for example, I know that a lot of times communities have, well, Gloucester City Hall has that beautiful spire, kind of like a church spire, but it's not. You know, it's not a spire. A spire is a church structure. What do you call those? Whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about. Tower.
Steeple.
Yeah, steeple means church though, and spire means church. But anyways, it has that big tower on it. And then, you know, the typical clock and bells on the top or whatever, like you'd see in a church, but it's not. You know, sometimes we get the question, well, we're going to use CPA money just to fix up the clock or the bells. And so we want to just put a restriction on the tower. And they go to Mass Historic, and Mass Historic says, no, we don't put restrictions on just pieces of buildings, because the whole idea is to protect anything from happening. If you just put a restriction on the tower, the rest of the building is required to hold the tower up. So what if the restriction doesn't cover the rest of the building and someone goes to tear the building down? What happens to the tower? You can have a restriction on the tower, but it's going to fall down. So, you know, putting restrictions on pieces of things when you're going through Mass Historic is tricky, and they're going to tell you whether they will or not. When you do a term restriction, less than 30 years, you can put anything you want in that restriction, because it's just an agreement between the city and the holder of the restriction, or the holder of the property and the holder of the restriction. So you could put it on just the fence, you know, you could do anything you want. It could be for 10 years, for 20 years. It could have strict, you know, restrictions in there that says you can't do anything without the approval of the restriction holder. Or it could say, you know, the only restriction is you have to keep it painted black. You know, I mean, it's totally up to you. You can do whatever you want on a term restriction. But it sounds like for the cemetery, you're looking at something more permanent, right? You probably don't want a term restriction.
I think the original plan was just to do a term restriction, but the cemetery is on the state and the national register. It's on both. And we
It is.
have another cemetery as well. We have two historic cemeteries, and they've both received CPA funds. So the question is going to be for both of those cemeteries, how long are we going to have the restriction, and what does it get put on the whole cemetery? Because now the other cemetery, it's the work that's being done is going to be on one of the gates, and as well as a building that's on the property too.
Yep.
So
what I would recommend is talk to Mass Historic. You know, I don't even know if they do restrictions, you know, if they hold restrictions on, you know, on cemeteries. So these are great questions for Mass Historic. They will definitely know how to do this and how to do it properly. And if it's going to be a permanent restriction, what things they're going to want to see and what they'll allow it to be and who they'll allow to hold it as well.
Stuart, I have a question on the cemetery. This is Sandy. Can they put a term restriction on the cemetery while they're working on putting a permanent restriction on it?
Can they put a term? Oh, I've never heard of that.
Maybe Kristen can ask Mass Historic Commission that question too. So because the permanent restriction takes so much longer and is so much more expensive, in order to make sure that this historic cemetery is protected, put a term restriction on it in the meantime while they're working towards the permanent restriction.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Sandy. It's a good one.
Okay.
I don't know.
So Kristen, maybe ask them that too.
okay, I'm writing it down.
Okay.
And the name you want to talk to, Kristen, and if you shoot me an email, I'll give you his contact information, is Michael Steinitz.
Oh, I have Michael Steinett's email. I've been in contact with him before.
He's the one who reviews all restrictions for Mass Historic. So
Okay.
tough to get a hold of, so be persistent.
Yeah, no, usually he emails, like I can get a hold of him through email, and I have talked to him before, so.
Right. He's
Yeah.
the guy.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, so Jim, I have 2 more slides, so, but we're getting on close to 8 o'clock here, so you tell me what you, everyone's probably wants to go have dinner or something, right? What do you want to do, Jim?
Well, if we go through them relatively quickly, maybe we can just shorten them up and, because I mean, your information is like so worthy for the committee in general.
All right, so one of the other questions Sandy had talked about was, and I don't know if this is related to a particular property or issue that's coming up now, but you can tell me. Once you have CPA, once you've acquired something with CPA funds, can you sell it? And the answer is yes. But as we've just discussed, that deed restriction has to be put on first, right? So if you buy a piece of conservation land or open space or recreation land, and the city decides they don't need it anymore, they can sell it, but it's going to have a conservation restriction put on it first. So that goes back to that situation I described to you before, where you buy a piece of open space and they want to use it for a school years later, again, CPA is not designed to buy a piece of land and then let it appreciate in value, and then the city needs money and they're going to go sell it. They can sell it, but it's going to be with a restriction on it, which means it's not going to be worth very much. So that's the whole idea of CPA, is to protect things. So yes, you can, but you have to have the restriction on it first, and then the money has to go back to CPA. So is there a particular project, Jim or Sandy, where you want to dig into this, or?
No, it's just that projects have been given CPC funding and later find out that it's going to be sold. I mean, a lot of people are dealing with challenges with COVID and everything. A lot of property is, people are having a hard time holding on to it. But I have a question. You said money must be returned to the CPA account from which it was appropriated. What do you mean by that statement?
Okay, so if you go to buy a piece of open space,
Yeah.
when you guys make recommendations, we recommend $500,000 be appropriated to the water department to buy, the Johnson, parcel. You tell the city council where you want that money to come from, right? Which funding source?
Right. Yes.
The undesignated fund, or whether you want them to bond it, or whether it comes out of the historic open space reserve, et cetera. So if in turn, in 5 years later, the water department decides to sell that land with the conservation restriction on it, and they got 600,000 for it, well, 500 would have to go back, and you'd have to go back at where you took that money from. So if 250 of that 500 came from the open space reserve, 250 goes back to the open space reserve. If the rest of the 250 came from the undesignated fund, it goes back to that account. Does that make sense? Or did I confuse you?
Makes sense.
Okay.
So they have to pay the money back to the CPC if they sell a property within a certain amount of time?
If the property was acquired with CPA funds.
Okay. All right.
So
Okay.
I'm feeling your question,
it.
even
Okay.
as sales of CPA funded properties, your question is not about properties that have been acquired with CPA funds. Your question is about properties that have just received CPA funding. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. The question was worded in such a way that it led me down the road here. So ignore this.
Okay. Yeah, I'm clear.
So that again is up to you guys, that's more to the situation like, where the town, the CPC didn't trust that the town was going to sell the building, afterwards, after they gave them the money for it. So they required the restriction on it, that there's no hard and fast rule about that in CPA or how to protect from that. If it's a private entity that you've given money to, well, they have to be able to sell their building, right? You can't,
Right.
you can't stop someone from selling a private building. So that's where the deed restriction is really important, because then your investment is protected. If they've received, $200,000 to put a new roof on their building and you have a historic preservation restriction on that, it's fine for them to go to sell it, because the new owner is going to have to keep that, historic building intact because you have a restriction on it. So, that's the example I gave.
That's the public purpose.
Right. The value you got out of that was not helping the guy with his roof and keeping the roof from leaking. The value you got out of that was that restriction. And no matter who owns that building forever, or for 30 years, whatever, if they sell it, you've got the restriction. They're keeping it beautiful and keeping it to historic standards. That was the value to you, not that you gave the guy money to fix up his roof and his roof doesn't leak anymore.
And that's what's happening in Plymouth, you said.
Yes. Yep. So that's why one of the difficulties in giving money to a private project is what happens if they do sell it and you don't have that restriction. How have you protected the public benefit? You can put something called a clawback agreement in there. So, and this may work with city properties, that you're worried about being sold, and where there's not a restriction in place, but you could say, if you do sell it within 10 years, you have to pay the money back to the CPA fund. That's called a clawback clause. Great Barrington uses those. I can give you a sample if you remind me by email of what a clawback clause looks like. That's another way to get at it too.
That's a really good idea.
All right. And then
Stuart, can I ask you to dabble into another topic really briefly?
Yeah.
Because I heard you say it was about bonding.
Yes.
Because I know we've done it, but I know it can explain. It's helpful to, I think, everyone, especially the new members, and how so many other communities actually use that as a tool for them.
Yeah. So I actually have a separate presentation, a separate 30-minute presentation just on CPA bonding, because there's a lot to know. And actually, I'm giving that presentation to another community, Jim, in a few weeks. And it's going to be on Zoom, and it's going to be, I could probably send you guys the link if you wanted to watch it. Not everyone broadcasts their Zoom meetings like you guys do live as they're happening. Some people just have it available, and to see it, you have to log into Zoom. But let me find out that for you.
Okay,
but
sounds good.
In general, just the 10-second version of it. The city bonds all the time against their future tax revenue stream to buy a fire truck or to build a school or that sort of thing. With CPA, you can do the same thing. You can bond against the future CPA revenue stream. So you've got that 1.5% revenue stream coming in every year to fund your CPA program. And if you've got a project in front of you where the water department wants to buy some land, or you want to rehabilitate a historic building in town, and you don't have the money in your account, but you want to do it, you can bond against your future CPA revenue stream, and then you just pay that back every year out of what your CPA proceeds are. And it's very powerful. We have about $350 million of outstanding CPA bonds in the state, and about 100 communities have bonded. So yeah, let's get you a link to that bonding presentation.
Thank you.
It's a town on the Cape. I think it's Harwich that I'm doing it for. So I'll see if they broadcast their meetings, or we can get you the Zoom link. And this is the last one, Sandy. I wasn't quite sure what your question was about this, in terms of.
Okay, this question was because we've had a vacancy from the housing authority for, Jimmy, what would you say, a couple years?
5 years.
Yeah. I mean, we just can't get housing authority members. And I know during our conversation, you mentioned one community that got very creative with getting a CPC member on their committee.
Yes.
Maybe you could quickly talk about that.
Yep. So unfortunately, the CPA legislation is written that there are 5 boards that are required to have a seat on the CPC, and there's nothing you can do about that. And one of them is the housing authority. And, not every community, lots of communities have individual boards that are not as robust as others sometimes, and they have trouble getting an appointee from that board. Sometimes it's the planning board. Often it's the housing authority. Sometimes Parks and Rec too, we often find. Your 4 at-large appointees, that's not an issue, but sometimes it can be difficult. And there are a couple things that we recommend in that case. The first is, have you ever been to a housing authority meeting?
No.
What I always suggest is that the CPC call the chair of the housing authority and get on their agenda.
Well,
And Yep.
We actually submitted citizen input because of Zoom into the housing authority, and they addressed it, but they've kind of then they spoke with corporation counsel, and corporation counsel contacted us, and they were kind of like looking at the bylaw on it, and who could it be and what, but nothing got resolved, and that was probably within the last month, I would say. Right,
Okay.
Sandy?
Yes.
you're beyond that then. I think you do need to, keep the pressure up. I mean, I don't know what corporation counsel is looking for. It's pretty plain, and obvious that, if they have a 5-member board, sometimes people ask, can the 5 members on the housing authority appoint someone else, like the housing authority executive director or a staff member? That's not allowed. It has to be one of the voting members.
They did ask that.
Yeah, a lot of times they ask that. But no, it has to be one of the voting members on the housing authority. So I keep up the pressure. That's all you can do, is to apply the public pressure and let them know it's hurting the creation of affordable housing for them not to have a seat at the table. Your board is not going to be as in tune as to what the needs are in the housing world unless you have a housing person on your board. And the second is it can create a quorum problem for you folks too. If you have 2 or 3 of these seats that go, vacant or unappointed, you can get to the point where every single one of you has to be at the meeting or you can't get a quorum, so it's unfair, to do that. So, you just can keep the pressure up. But I did hear about something really creative that another community did. It would require changing your ordinance. There's an ordinance that created your committee that the city council passed, many years ago when CPA was first established. We have a copy of it on our website, on our individual community page. We have every community's ordinance or bylaw that created their community preservation committee. You would have to amend that, and the city council is the one who amends that. But one community thought of the idea of if the seat goes vacant for 60 days, the chair of that board is automatically appointed as the representative to the CPC. So if the housing authority didn't send an appointment after 60 days, the chair of the housing authority is officially declared the appointee. And you can bet that chair is going to facilitate a discussion and make sure someone's appointed to that position. Because he already has
Stuart,
work as chair. Yes.
Stuart, maybe if the CPC committee sends a letter to the housing authority that the next step is that they're going to address this through city council ordinance unless they vote on someone, rather than going to the city council at this point, maybe giving them that one last shot.
Well, I don't know if I'd recommend that. I mean, that makes it a much more adversarial relationship, and it's almost like a little bit of a threat. So I don't know if that's the best way to gain cooperation.
Maybe put it on the agenda for discussion for the committee then.
Yeah, and by the way, you'd have to check with your city solicitor as to whether they, would allow that under your charter too.
Okay.
There's all sorts of things about appointments that are different in individual city charters. So, but in any event, there is not much you can do about this situation other than to, apply the pressure and an appeal to the individuals who are on that board, how they're really missing an opportunity to do their jobs, which is create more housing in Fall River by not being on your board, and that they're creating a problem for your board quorum wise too. But unfortunately, that's really all you can do. We actually, this is coming up a little bit more often, and our steering committee is actually going to discuss this because it seems like there should be something else you could do to make sure you had a housing person on your board. It's too important a seat to go unfilled. So we're gonna talk about that at our March steering committee meeting.
And then I think the last point of the agenda was the committee had questions on some of the projects, and I know on the agenda it says that it's attached, but that list of projects is on our website for any of the public that's listening that wants to see them. Just go to the CPC page on the city website and you'll see a full list of all of the projects. But Jimmy, I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, so I don't know, I don't know if does the board want to continue on, there's a few on the list to go through of this year's projects. I don't know how much longer the board wants to entertain the meeting. Is everybody willing to like continue on? No, yes, yeah. So we'll just maybe just go through them briefly if we can, one of them is a street tree planting program.
Oh, I think that one was already determined. I think.
Maple with the lighting, we went through that before. I think the bell tower, I think going through the list on whether it's eligible or not on our own is good enough to go through that one also. The ones I think that are the biggest ones to contemplate are the city armory, not the city armory flex space, but the Quikasham Falls walkway. Did you see that? Had you seen that one, Stuart?
Yes, Stuart has seen all of them.
Yeah, so that would be the one I believe that would be the one I would speak about mostly. And in Stuart's comments, it does explain about who owns the certain, because it's a long length of a walkway, we'll call it. So who owns all the different parcels along the way? That's going to be that's something that should be known, I believe, by the who submitted the application was the city planner. And I think we need to know for sure who owns all the parcels to create this. But your explanation about it being more of a study as opposed to actual funding of a project seems kind of clear to me.
Yeah, and there are cases where you can fund studies. There's no question that it's part of the CPA process. But your citizens definitely did not vote themselves a voluntary tax increase for the city to do a lot of studies. They voted themselves this so they'd see parks being rehabilitated that look great, open space being protected, historic, facades being redone, to see actual projects. If it had been on the ballot, a 1.5% surcharge to give City Hall money for planning purposes and studies, I guarantee you would not have had a successful adoption vote in CPA. So it is the nature of the business that, plans and studies are necessary, but you really want to keep your project spending in CPA much more limited in that regard for planning and studies. It's just not what CPA was intended for, and it's not really what your citizens want to see out of your program. You really want to. You have very limited resources, and there certainly are $1 million worth of shovel-ready projects that are out there, every year. Those are the kind of projects that you really want to get to. If the city uses its regular funds and its regular planning and other grants and that sort of thing to sketch this whole thing out, that's short money. What they're going to really need from you is the $1 million to construct this walkway, so my advice would be to, in a lot, not in all cases, but if you get a lot of these planning applications, you really should reserve your funding for the actual project.
I think a lot of these projects that we have on this list, by really going through that allowable uses chart and figuring out which block they fit into, is going to clarify a lot.
Definitely. It's a great chart to use. It won't answer the question that you just asked about, studies, because that question is whether the study is an eligible expense of a creation of a project. And it is. It's just a question whether it's a good idea, and whether you want to, be spending large sums of CPA money on these initial planning projects that could take decades to come together and may never come together. CPA is just really not that kind of funding source.
Okay. Like I say, I think a lot of these projects that are on this particular list, by going through that allowable uses chart, it's really going to put it in or out of a category. So, does anybody else have any questions for Stuart? No? Well, thank you, Stuart, for doing this training session. I think I'm definitely important to everybody. Obviously, our two new members, I'm sure it's given them a lot of insight into CPC. And we appreciate you, coming online for us.
No problem. I'll see if I can find that bonding presentation to invite you to, and if not, I'll come back and do it for you guys at some point.
Does anybody have any questions for Stuart? Any others? I do have one thing I have to say unexpectedly, that I have submitted my letter of resignation, and I wanted to say this to the board in this meeting and not just send this letter in. I mean, I've been on the board for 8 years and I've enjoyed my time on here, but for several reasons, one being that I'm part of the Fall River Preservation Society and we are involved in a new preservation project that only allows one of us to be on a board at a time. Alex is also on the Preservation Society. I'm on it too. So it really only allows one of us to be here. And the other reason is partial. It's not personal, but it's with my business where I need to really focus on it in the next 5 months. And I don't want to go into why, but for those two reasons, I really have to resign. Unfortunately, I feel bad doing it. I wanted to last a little bit longer, but my thought process was to get off it quicker and hopefully get somebody else on sooner so that once these funding rounds come through and the deliberation for funding rounds go through, hopefully we'll have somebody else in my position before that time frame. So I've thought about it and I agonized over it, but I have to do it at the moment. And but I wanted to personally say it this way. And I thank Stuart for, conversing with me online many times. And I want to thank Sandy and all the board members, past and present. I've enjoyed my time on here. So that's about it. So
You'll be missed. I know I'll miss you.
Jim, you have been a terrific member of the CPC and a terrific chair, and have really poured your heart and soul into the program for Fall River. And you've been there from the very beginning, and I for one will miss interacting with you. You've left a great legacy for Fall River in terms of having CPA funding. So thank you for everything you gave.
thank you. I mean, I'm definitely someone I would still want to be involved with, bouncing questions off of or thoughts or whatever ideas, but at this time, I'm just not able to commit the time I need because I have to commit it in other areas. So, so with that being said, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
And do I have a second?
I'll second.
So I have a motion by John and a second by Chris to adjourn. All in favor? I'll make a roll call. John Brandt,
Yes.
Kristen Cantara Oliveira,
Yes.
John Ferreira,
Yes.
Victor Farias,
Yes.
Carolyn Auburn,
Yes.
Alex Silva,
Yes.
and James Souza. I say yes also. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.